So we're going to move on to our second presenter, Ivy Francis. She's the chief of the Floodplain Management Insurance Branch for the Federal Emergency Management Agency here in Boston. And she is going to start us off on our discussion of hazard mitigation and adaptation strategies.
So I do want you to close your eyes, but I don't want you to go to sleep. Thank you for inviting me here, and I'm very pleased to be here. I always welcome the chance to share some of the unique experiences that I have because of the position that I hold. But what I want to talk to you today is about tension and trade-offs, and how do we make those decisions. So I do want you to close your eyes for just one moment, if you will, and think about Boston, or think about the city that you're from, and how did it get there? How did the landscape, how did it evolve? So it's not a linear line, but when you think about Boston, we went from cow paths to roads. We flattened hills and we filled in swamps. We look at politics and protest and indifference and knowledge, and how do we get here? It's not so much about a linear line. It's kind of a lot about chaos. And you're now a part of that chaos as planners and thinking about sustainability. So we have to embrace that in order to move forward. So so now that we have some order and we have some chaos, now we introduce a moving target. And if you think we have it bad, this is from a quote from where they were trying to do a public involvement process in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. So they're doing it there. I think we can do it here. So what's at risk? This is what's at risk in the United States for sea level rise. And actually, FEMA says that floods are going to increase 45% by the year 2100. So we have trade-offs in how we deal with that. What's our public policy? Trade-offs between disaster relief and the National Flood Insurance Program. So disaster relief, it's all about repair, rebuild, but the cost is based on the need. There's no budget. So, and you know, disasters are us. I mean, this is what's happening. And I don't know about you, but I have a really hard time conceptualizing $1 billion. When we just throw that number around like it's nothing. And we really need to think about that. Or maybe we don't. Economics will tell out. This is my description right now of the National Flood Insurance Program. We're $24 billion in debt. So why doesn't it work? What is going on that it's so costly? So I want to talk about the National Flood Insurance Program too. And Rich, I want to thank you because you did a great job of really putting that out there in such a short amount of time. And as Rich mentioned, we have mapping, insurance, and regulations. But what I want to try to do is shed some light on what the strengths of those programs are or those sectors are and where are our challenges. And that's where you come in. And it's I'm excited by the fact that we have something to really chew on here. And we have an opportunity to make a difference. And there's a lot of people who have jobs who don't have that opportunity like we do. So it sounds like you talked a lot about mapping, but really mapping informs us of the risk. It does it in an odd kind of way, but it does inform us of the risk. But, and as Rich had said, they're used primarily to figure out the premiums, but they don't account for future change, such as sea level rise. We do account for human-made structures that change the frequency, but they do not change the fact that it's going to flood. And that's really, really important because we think we put a levee in, we put a dam in, people move in behind it, and great, no more flooding. But it's just a matter of time before that area goes back to its natural floodplain. So again, as Rich had said, catastrophic events were not really planned for in the NFIP. We've paid $4.6 billion since 1978 for repetitive lost properties. So those are properties that haven't flooded once, maybe they flooded twice, or they flooded 3 times. And we keep paying out for that, and we don't charge them more of a premium because they've been flooded or because they've made a claim. We have pre-firm structures, which are structures that were there before the maps. They get a subsidized rate because their structure is not built for what zone that they're in the map. And additionally, we also, if we then now do a new map and your structure is there, we will grandfather that zone in. So again, a bit of a subsidy because we're not charging the rate that we would had you had to build toward that zone. So again, there's these subsidies that you're paying and I'm paying as taxpayers so that these people are living in a flood risk that they're not necessarily paying the premium that we should be. So that creates that tension that I spoke of. Tension between the taxpayer and the folks who are paying premiums and living in a high-risk area. So let's talk a little bit about regulations. Not an easy job, not a job I would want as a local floodplain administrator. They have several hats, there's a lot of turnover, and you try to tell your neighbor they can't build their dream home in the floodplain. It's not easy. And so and the other thing I want to mention here is they also have to look at substantially damaged or improved structures, which means the regulations say if you have a structure and it gets more than 50% damaged or it gets improved 50% of the market value, it then has to build towards the zone that it is in. So it's unbelievable to me how many 58% of the fair market value of the homes get damaged nowadays. They don't meet the threshold. And it's very difficult. This isn't an easy job, as I had said. The other thing that I'll tell you about the regulations, they don't cover all who have flood losses. We have about 20% of flood losses are folks who are not even within the special flood hazard area or the area that's mapped. So what do we have? We have now we have the National Flood Insurance Program, and we still have more costly disasters. And so in the early 1900s, we thought we had the answer. We were going to build these levees and dams, and we did that. They were very costly, but they protected people. But guess what happened? People then moved in behind them and said, hey, there's no flooding. All this land now is opened up to development. And then it flooded. And so now we had more people getting flooded, and the insurance company said, we can't make a profit on this. And so in the mid-'60s, a report went out that went through Congress, and that's where the National Flood Insurance Program was born. It was actually after Hurricane Betsy that the flood insurance companies just really kind of bowed out of the program. So again, the federal government is saying, now wait a minute, we're paying all this money to build all these structures and they're not working. And so now we want to transfer some of that cost of living in the floodplain to those who are actually residing in the floodplain. Again, that tension. We're trying to move that line. So public policy, what's that all about in flooding? So I really want to talk about public policy and what happens when we think something or a program is going to work and when it's actually put down on the road, I guess. So for flooding, public policy, what do we recognize? A flood is going to flood no matter what we do in its natural floodplain. You can put in all the culverts you want, but when that flood event exceeds that design storm, it's going to go where it naturally floods. The cost of development in a floodplain should include the disaster cost as a disincentive to build there. Does that make sense to folks? A disincentive. We need disincentives for developing in the floodplain. But we all benefit from development in the floodplain, so they're not necessarily the bad guys. So we're a part of that also. And many of us, as myself, I live near the coast. So, but we can also benefit economically by avoiding development in the floodplain and recognizing the natural benefits. Is this all making sense? I know it's a lot. So, so again, disaster costs must be built into the cost of floodplain development. So how do we get there? So education is a piece of how we get there and is really, really important. And what we don't emphasize enough is education. We tell them about bills, we tell them about insurance, we kind of tell them about maps, but we don't really center our information on education. So how about we educate the folks who live there, who work and play in floodplains, and tell them what it's all about? How about we talk to developers and educate them on, hey, you know, you're getting a pretty good deal here, but you're passing on the cost of that disaster relief on to those who are now living in the floodplain. And realtors who are there when property gets transferred, how about they let folks know? That's a real tension point between when property is transferred, because people who move into the floodplain, they might not know that. So how about I throw out some ideas? Now, I've been around flooding and policies, and I've been a local official in an area that flooded quite often. So I just want to say that these are not FEMA ideas. These are not FEMA ideas. These aren't necessarily even my ideas. But these are a compilation of ideas that throughout this profession and throughout folks who are involved in floodplains, coastal management, that have been out there. And I just want to go through some of those. So how about we map the natural floodplain? What would happen if we did that? And that we didn't really look and then we spread out the risk among a much larger area, because we all contribute to flooding if we live in a floodplain, including on the coast. What if the state regulated flood insurance? There's been a lot of talk about privatizing flood insurance, and I could talk a little bit about that. We can compare it to the Homeowners Fair Plan Act here in Massachusetts. What if communities self-insure? So here's some of the tension. FEMA does the maps. It's FEMA's regulations. It's FEMA that administers the National Flood Insurance Program, and FEMA doles out disaster relief. And then FEMA wants to know, how come your communities aren't more involved? It's all of our stuff. And what I want to say is, how do we bring that ownership back to the community? Maybe this is one way, but we need to be aggressive if we're going to keep up. Regulations, we need to be stricter. We need to increase technical assistance to communities. And when we map, we need to talk about the uniqueness in each community. So I want to add, oh, I lost a slide. I want to add a leg to Rich's stool. I have a four-legged stool, and I want to add people to that equation. Because I'll tell you, if people don't get it, we're not going to get very far, and that tension will turn into conflict. So we don't have an answer, but it's about engaging people. It's about inventing tools. We don't know. I talked about the Pilgrims. Did they figure out cars and freeways? Did they know Boston was going to look? Could they envision the Boston of today? So how do we envision the Boston 200 years from now? We need to really invent some tools. And we need to throw all this stuff out and start thinking with a cleaner slate, a clean slate. So, and it can be done. And I've been part of a process where we did this, where we brought The community meeting started with, hell no, we won't go. We wanted to buy out an area. And we were able to do that because every single community meeting, we started out with education. And every single community meeting, we had choices that people could make. And guess what? That floodplain became their own. And when one of the neighbors called me up and said, hey, some guy came by and threw a mattress over there in the floodplain, it wasn't a vacant lot anymore, he said, don't worry about it, I'll take it to the dump. They now had ownership of that floodplain. All right, so I'm getting the hook here. But technical assistance, we really need to get us all here in this room, this is great. We all know this stuff, but if we don't get it out to the folks who are living it, this is what's gonna happen. We had some really good reform out there, but guess who we didn't talk to? The people who owned homes. Bigot Waters went smack into the American dream and said, you bought a home under good faith, and now we're gonna charge you a bunch of money to live there. And it wasn't affordable. And the hook is coming. So, here, this report, I want you to all write down that report, because everything that I just, and Rich mentioned this is the report that went to Congress that was signed by President Johnson that created the National Flood Insurance Program. Nothing that I said here today is new. It's all in that report. So please, it's pretty, just put that in Google and you'll get it up. And that's me, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Ivy.